Hello. Did you know that a lady named Susan Smith knowingly drove her kids into a lake with her 2 children strapped in the back seat? Think of how they felt as the cold water rushed into the cabin of the car, which ultimately drowned them. Barbaric is the word that I would use to describe her actions. But yet, the jury rejected the death penalty and chose her a life sentence instead. Sorry about that. Mr. Smith, the father of the 2 kids, broken up by the ruling, said that him and his family were disappointed that the death penalty was not the verdict. But it wasn't our choice, from StudyWorld.com. I'm here tonight to speak on the issue of capital punishment. Capital punishment has many positive benefits for the United States, such as preventing murders from occurring, and it would also be cheaper if it weren't for these seemingly unnecessary law processes taken, which are my 2 points that I will discuss tonight. Now let's talk about my first point, which is capital punishment prevents murder. The refusal of capital punishment results in the increase in the number of the deaths of innocent people. Since 1967, there has been 1 execution for every 1,600 murders. Capital punishment also helps prevent violent crimes from occurring. If we execute these murderers, it will prevent them from murdering others. This effect of capital punishment prevents potential murders because of the fear of execution. The murder rate dropped from a high 1,020,000 in 1980 to 570,000 in 1999, a 44% reduction. The murder rate is now the lowest level since 1966. According to Dudley Sharp of the Criminal Justice Reform Group, Justice for All, the Texas murder rate in 1991 was 1.5 million. By 1999, it had fallen to 610,000, a 60% drop. Within Texas, the most aggressive death penalty prosecutors are in the Houston area. Since the resumption of execution in 1982, the annual numbers of Harris County murders have plummeted from 701 to 241, a 72% decrease. Also, according to Justice for All, 9 to 15% of those on death row committed at least 1 additional murder prior to the murder which they are being put on death row for. 67% had a prior felony conviction, 42% had an active criminal justice status when they committed their capital offense. 14% of them were sentenced to death from 1988 to 1994, had received 2 or more death sentences. Nothing that is worth having comes without risk. Consider that thousands of American citizens are murdered each year by released and paroled criminals. There is no point in keeping murderers alive, and it is far more dangerous to innocent people than to put them to death. Now let's talk about my second point, which is that capital punishment would be less expensive if the processes weren't taken, or the processes that were taken weren't required. The cost for justice does not have to be so high for the execution of murderers. If we only allowed appeals that are relevant in providing one's innocence and eliminating the many more that are used merely as delaying tactics, it would save millions of taxpayers' dollars. States found it necessary to introduce a complex appeal process that would guarantee the rights of death row inmates. Capital trials are much more expensive to carry out than are their non-capital counterparts because of the price at stake, the life of the accused. Evidence gathering is also more expensive. Evidence must be collected not only to determine the guilt of the innocent or of the accused, but also to support or contradict a sentence to death. All sentences of death face a mandatory review by the state Supreme Court, an additional of $70,000 per case. If a case advances further than the state or federal appeal process, the costs are likely to jump to $275,000 or more for each appeal. In the state of Kansas, they concluded that capital cases are 70% more expensive than comparable non-death cases. The study counted death penalty case costs through to execution found the median death penalty case cost $1.26 million. Non-death penalty cases were counted through to the end of the incarceration and were found to the median cost of $740,000 of the total. For the death penalty cases and the pretrial and the trial level expenses were most of the expensive part. 49% of the total cost. The cost of appeals were 29% in the total expense, and the incarceration and the execution cost accounting for the remaining 22%. In comparison to non-death penalty cases, the following findings were revealed. The investigation costs for death sentence cases were about 3 times greater than non-death cases. The trial costs for death cases were about 16 times greater than non-death cases, and the appeal costs were 21 times greater. The cost of carrying out a death sentence were about half the cost of carrying out non-death sentence cases, also according to the Death Penalty Information Center. So tonight I've talked about capital punishment and its benefits for the United States, which were once again that capital punishment prevents murders, and it would be cheaper if these seemingly unnecessary processes weren't taken.
All right, the example that you used to get our attention is fine. You identified the claim. I think it could be highlighted a little bit more. The secondary claims are labeled adequately. But then the rest of the speech really seems to be about just the 2 secondary claims and not what the major proposition is. And especially on the second of those points, I'm not sure that you're making much of an inference. I don't know that anybody doubts that the appeals costs are substantial. You're saying, well, if we got rid of the appeals process, it would be cheap. What's to dispute about that? You know, I'm not exactly sure that there's some big surprise on that. That's like saying, well, if, you know, like you said earlier, if we execute them, they can't kill anybody. There's no dispute about that either. But do executions prevent murders? In other words, you mentioned the one statistic that I think really is applicable there is that there are 1,000 people who were killed by released paroled killers. That one definitely applies to your argument. The statistics that you present on Texas and the Houston area are probably useful, but the way they're being presented is completely confusing. You've got a couple of statistics that you're presenting, 1.5 million down to 610,000. I'm going, what is that talking about? I don't know what you were explaining. I know it's not, we dropped from 1.5 million murders to 610,000 murders. I don't know what the inference is here. It's not very clear. It's a little bit clear about how the murder rates declined in some of those areas. I thought that those statistics were a little bit better, but you're inconsistent in the way you're presenting the information. And one of the problems is that I think you just start presenting information, and instead of telling us what this information means and how it leads to this particular inference, you just pile on more data. I got a whole long list outlining what all of the costs of the appeals process are. What does that get you? I'm not sure it advances a claim. It illustrates what the source of the cost is, but it doesn't really necessarily show that execution would be cheaper, except if we got rid of all those appeals, which, like I said before, I don't think is really a controversial sort of statement. So you need to take the information that you have and put it into inferences, and then talk to us about those inferences, and not just kind of dump out data, one piece of information after another, because I don't think that that's very convincing. All right, thank you.